One miracle after another. The Pavel Goya story. Chapter 10. For better or for worse. When Pavel completed the first 2 years of classes, he and Dana had decided the time had come to end their long-distance relationship. It would be a bit of a rush, fitting a wedding between a semester break, but they didn't mind. They were getting married. Accepting the offer from his uncle in Turnu-Severin to use his spacious home for the wedding reception, the last-minute preparations were made. From now on, they would be making the trips from Turnu-Severin to Bucharest together. The day they had been dreaming of for some time finally came. Family and friends, coming from afar and near, anxious to celebrate the happy day with them, filled the church. As Dana began her measured walk toward Pavel and the pastor, every guest in the crowded building faded from his vision. The beauty of the young woman in the wedding dress, walking towards him, captivated his full attention. With each approaching step, the object of his dreams came closer to becoming a reality. For years he had dreamed of this moment, and now he was living it. With their eyes fixed on each other, she approached him, standing with the pastor at the front of the church. Extending his hand to hers, his lips sent her a silent, "I love you," as his fingers gently caressed her hands. Dana had finally said yes. She had agreed to marry him. If only she would have seen the wisdom of his plan from the beginning, he would have been spared years of anxious anticipation. Her lack of interest to be his bride in first grade had been the primary object of his consternation. Throughout grade school, she had ignored even his most impressive schemes to sweep her off her feet. How she had resisted his flirting for all those years was indeed a mystery. Now, standing hand in hand before the pastor, both Dana and Pavel knew that their lives were meant to be joined together. It was a beautiful service, attended by guests and family from home, as well as by many of the friends Pavel had made in Bucharest. In many ways, the guest list resembled a choir recital. With the communist government slightly relaxing its iron fist policy against religion, churches had sprung up everywhere. For the past year, Pavel had gone from church to church, developing choirs. Several had become quite renowned, performing throughout the European continent. In his honor, several had come to serenade him and his bride. Without a doubt, this wedding had more choir music than any royal family had ever experienced. The day of feasting and celebrating at his uncle's home finally came to a close, with guests wishing them well before leaving for home. The festivities had been more wonderful than they could have imagined. It was truly a day they would remember for the rest of their lives. There'd be no time for a honeymoon for now. They would have to wait for a break in Pavel's classes. He had to be back on campus the next morning. How thankful he was for the nice apartment and the regular monthly budget his father had provided for his education. At least they had a place of their own to call home. Very few enjoyed the luxury of continuing their education without having to worry about finances. They felt truly blessed. For several months, all went well. Pavel continued at the top of his class, and Dana set out to make a bachelor's apartment into a little home, enhanced by the graces of a woman's special touch. Pavel was amazed at the transformation that had taken place. Using a few simple things, Dana had changed the drab and ordinary into delicate and enchanting. With each passing day, their love for each other and for God grew stronger. Without warning, they received bad news from home. Pavel's father had been diagnosed with leukemia, and his illness made it impossible for him to continue his business. Adding to their concern for his health was their realization that without his financial assistance, they would have to seriously rearrange their budget. Soon after the news, the monthly 2,500 lei they had been receiving decreased to 2,000 lei. The next month, only 1,500 lei came. As Mr. Goya's medical expenses increased and the Goya family savings decreased, so did the money they were able to send to Pavel and Dana. It was going to be a real challenge to finish Pavel's last 2 years at the university. There simply was not enough money to pay for rent and to buy food. It didn't add to their comfort to know that they would soon be parents. Dana was due any day with their first child. How would they meet the needs of their new baby if they weren't even able to care for themselves? They would just have to trust God and do the best they could. A few weeks later, Gabriel was born. They loved the new addition to their family, but things were getting desperate. Each month, the decline in income had continued until they were down to 400 lei per month. They had no food for days on end. This was the hungriest either of them had ever been. Some mornings they lay in bed feeling too weak to get up. Together, they would claim God's promises to take care of them. Often, recounting the miracles God had worked for the generation before them gave them strength. Remembering one of his father's favorite experiences, Pavel said, "Dana, let me tell you a story." Lying next to his wife, staring at the ceiling, he began, "You know that our parents' generation lived through a very difficult time under communism. It cost many of them everything they had to remain faithful to God. But they didn't mind, because their eyes looked forward to another reward, homes waiting in heaven. They lived each day desiring to introduce others to the one who had died in order to offer them eternal life. When I was young, my father worked long and hard, carefully saving his money in order to take short leaves of absence from his construction business. With his carefully saved money, he purchased Christian books from underground sources to sell to those living in nearby villages. You know how extremely dangerous it was to share or sell religious books. Speaking to the wrong person might mean a lengthy prison term or an accidental death as the result of a beating. But the good news was too good to keep to themselves. They had to share it. My father and his friend Benny often set out as a team on gospel book-selling expeditions. They would quickly make their way through a village just before dark and then slip into the surrounding forest for protection before the alerted authorities had time to follow up on the tip that Christian books were being sold. They often walked all night through the dense forests in order to be ready to enter another village the following evening. More often than not, their food and money ran out before they were ready to return home. When exhaustion overtook them, they would sleep in the forest as comfortably as they could. Spending the night in the forest with cold and wet clothing was miserable, but they pressed on with the constant desire that just one more person might enjoy eternity as a result of their sacrifice. Turning toward Dana, he continued, "On one of these missions for God, Benny and my father had tirelessly sheared in village after village. It had been several days since they had left home, and they had eaten the last of their food 3 days earlier. The last of their money also had been spent. Feeling tired, hungry, and joyful all at the same time, they pressed on. It had been worth all the sacrifice, as several opportunities had opened before them to speak of Jesus, the one they loved with all their hearts. Both of their backpacks, once filled with books, were now nearly empty. Many searching people would now find meaning for their lives. Walking through the forest by moonlight, they recounted the providences of God over their missionary expedition. In order to keep oriented, they walked parallel to the mountain roads. After walking for some distance, they came to a deep mountain gorge. The only way to cross to the other side was a nearby footbridge made of ropes and boards. It was old and rickety, but there was simply no other way to make it to the other side without taking a very long and circuitous alternate route. Carefully they scanned the road in both directions for other travelers who might discover them. When they were certain all was clear, they hurried to cross the bridge. As carefully as they could, they walked with their backpacks, trying to maintain the necessary cadence needed to navigate the giant tightrope bridge. They continued to share their experiences as they hurried to reach the other side. My father led the way, with Benny following close behind. In mid-sentence, Benny cried out, "Stop!" My father froze in his tracks, not daring to move. He slowly turned his head back to Benny. "What's wrong?" he asked anxiously. "Look down," came the faint reply. My father looked down at the bridge beneath him. His foot was resting solidly on one of the crossboards, but his back foot was resting on nothing, just air. He was standing on the bridge fully supported, as if all the boards were in place. In the moonlight, he could see the bottom of the deep mountain gorge far beneath him. With his front foot being the only part of his body supported by the bridge, his heart raced wildly. Ever so carefully, he stepped forward to the next board. Turning around, he peered cautiously at the gaping hole created by the missing boards. It was nearly 4.5 feet wide. In silence, both he and Benny just stared at the hole in the bridge separating them. Benny now realized he still had to find a way to get across the hole in the bridge. Removing his empty backpack, he tossed it to my father, who was now standing on the other side of the gaping hole. Moving several paces forward to allow a landing area, my father waited with bated breath for Benny to jump across the hole in the bridge. With a mighty leap, Benny flew across the opening, causing the old bridge to sway and bounce wildly in response. When the bridge ceased to bob up and down and weave back and forth, they carefully made their way across to the other side. Once their feet were back on solid ground, they praised God for keeping them from certain death. Together, they repeated the words in Psalm 91. "For he will give his angels charge over you, to guard you in all your ways. They will bear you up in their hands." God had indeed sent his angels to place their hands under the feet of his messengers of mercy. My father told me that as long as he lived, he would never forget how it felt to stand on angels' hands in the middle of the night, suspended over a deep mountain gorge. After an hour of walking and talking about the miracle God had just performed for them, they were inspired by their 3-day-old hunger pangs to pray another prayer. "Lord, if you can hold us up with the hands of angels, surely you can help us find some food. We're feeling weak and tired. Please help us find some food so we will be able to make it to the next village." Though they couldn't see the answer, they thanked God for his love and watchful care as they walked through the forest. All of a sudden, my father felt his head thump against a large object dangling by a rope from a branch overhead. Swinging on the rope was a large, round, oven-sized loaf of bread. Once again, they praised God for such an abundance of food. The giant loaf of bread was more than enough to fill 2 empty stomachs. You see, Dana, sometimes we have to wait. But God never forgets us in our hour of need, Pavel said as he ended his story. Together, they prayed for strength and wisdom to know what they should do. Without the money to pay rent, they were forced to move in with a relative. The complicated living arrangements resulted in a very tense situation. After a few weeks, when things became unbearable, some friends came to their rescue, offering them a portion of their home as a shelter until they could find something else. Although thankful, they were still without money to buy food for themselves and little Gabriel. From time to time, Pavel went out into the streets collecting cans in order to buy a little milk for their baby. But there was never any money left over for him and Dana. They were desperate. Remembering the 40 lei he had set aside from the last 400 lei his family had sent, he decided that they just had to have some food. He would borrow God's 40 lei and pay it back when he received his next 400 lei in the mail. They were desperately hungry. Surely God would understand. The good news was that Mr. Goya appeared to be making real progress in his fight against leukemia. His white blood cell count had returned to almost normal after 10 months of natural treatments. The doctor remained cautiously optimistic, advising him not to resume any strenuous activity until his body regained strength. However, Mr. Goya had a honey business that couldn't wait for more than a few weeks. If he were going to place his beehives for the season, he had to do it now. Loading 85 super hives in a truck, he traveled several hours to the mountains where abundant fields of clover had provided him many years of the finest honey. After unloading the last large hive, he lay down in exhaustion to rest for a few minutes on the grass. 9 hours later, he awoke, wet and cold, and feeling feverish. He returned home. In his weakened condition, he had contracted pneumonia from sleeping on the cold, wet ground. His body had very little strength to fight back after his long battle with leukemia. In 5 short days, his valiant fight for life ended. His life had been lived as a true champion. He had remained faithful to God in the face of bitter opposition. He now rested in the blessed hope of a soon returning Savior. His name no doubt listed among the faithful, waiting to receive the eternal crown of life. Returning from the funeral, Pavel and Dana felt as dark and hopeless as at any time they could remember. The move to their friend's house had not turned out any better than it had with relatives. In desperation, they accepted the offer to live in the attic of a church member. This would have been bad enough at any time of the year, but it was the middle of summer, and it was hot. The attic air was simply stifling, and it was nearly impossible to fall asleep with their clothes sticking to their sweat-soaked bodies. Little Gabriel didn't mind letting them know that he was not pleased with their new living arrangement either. What were they going to do? How much longer would they have to live in these impossible conditions? To add to Pavel's misery, his conscience had not let him forget the money he had spent that belonged to God. He had planned to repay it from the money that would come the next month. However, the money hadn't come, nor would it ever be coming. His father's death ended the hope of any more money from home. Dark thoughts followed him wherever he went. Surely God must be punishing him for the use of his money. The little Goya family had come to the end of their rope. The vows they had made on their wedding day had not turned out for better but definitely for worse. It felt as if God had forgotten them. In the hot, sticky attic, Pavel and Dana knelt, asking God to help them know what to do. They reminded him that he had promised that he would never leave them nor forsake them. They asked him for the courage to remain true to him while they waited for his answer. When they finished praying, they agreed they wouldn't tell anyone about their need. Why should they? They had just given it to God. Entering the church, they were greeted with a warm welcome from Titus, one of the church elders. "Pavel, can I talk to you for a minute?" Curious, they followed Titus to a quiet corner of the church. Looking earnestly at them, the elderly man began. "A few days ago, I had a dream. In my dream, you came to me crying. When I asked you what you were crying about, you told me you had no place to live." Pausing for a moment to study the faces of the young couple before him, Titus asked, "Is it true? Have you been praying for a place to live?" "Yes, it's true. We have no money, and we've been staying in a hot attic for the past few weeks." "Well, now I know why God gave me that dream. You see, I have a big apartment that's vacant in a nice part of the city. My wife and I lived there until she died a couple years ago. No one has lived there since. It's completely furnished and is close to one of the city's biggest shopping centers. I think you'd be quite comfortable there after you cleaned it up a bit. If you're willing to do the cleaning and pay for your utilities, you may live there for free as long as you're in school. How does that sound?" A tear of joy ran down Dana's cheek in answer to his question. Together, they thanked him for his wonderful offer in answer to their prayers. "I hope you have a nice time at church today," he said, with a twinkle in his eye as he turned to enter the sanctuary. It took very little coaxing for Dana to begin packing their things in the attic. Even though several uninvited creatures had moved into the empty apartment, they had a real home once again. After a long week of cleaning, the apartment was finally spick and span. It was wonderful to have a place to live, but they still had no food. Surely God hadn't forgotten about their other need. Realizing he had given a church member a dream in order to provide them a place to live, encouraged them to keep trusting him. As days turned into weeks with almost no food, they experienced hunger as they had never known it. The few cans Pavel could sell barely kept little Gabriel from starving, but did nothing to relieve the gnawing in their stomachs. Now dizzy spells were setting in as a result of going day after day without eating. They were starving. The only way for partial relief was to lie down and hope the dizziness would pass. Something had to happen soon. Walking home from university one day, Pavel began to pray. "Please forgive me for using your money. I promise you that if you help me repay your money, I will never use a penny of tithe money for myself again, even if I die. From this day on, I will be faithful." He continued to pray as he walked the rest of the 8 miles from the university to his apartment. He longed for peace with God as much as he longed for food. Arriving back at the apartment, he found a letter from home waiting for him. Inside was 50 lei. What an answer to prayer. Money for food. Feeling hungrier than he had ever had in his life, he remembered the promise he had just made to God. In spite of his extreme hunger, he decided to keep his promise. He owed 40 lei from the money he had borrowed previously, and 5 lei for the tithe from the 50 lei he had just received. Taking 45 lei from the envelope, he mailed it to the church treasurer before he had time to be tempted to rationalize a later repayment. He had just 5 lei left. Together, he and Dana walked to the store. They bought a little bread and some yogurt as the 2 cheapest food items they could find to keep them alive. It was a pretty small bag of groceries, but both of them were glad they had repaid God's money. A couple of days later, as he was walking home from the university, Pavel decided to take a little shortcut through one of the city parks. Oblivious to his surroundings, he prayed and cried each weary step of his journey home. Startled to hear his name called, he turned to see a very elderly man sitting on a park bench. "Pavel, how are you doing?" he asked. "Oh, I'm fine." "You don't look fine. You're crying. You don't know me, but I know you. Every week, I see you singing in the choir. I'm just a 92-year-old retired lawyer who sits in the congregation enjoying your singing each week. Now tell me, where are you going?" "I'm on my way home from the university." "That's a long way to walk every day. You don't have any money for the bus, do you?" "It's okay. I don't mind walking." "You don't look okay. You look miserable. Please, sit down for a minute. I want to talk to you. I've been planning to help someone with my money, and I've been waiting for God to show me someone who really needs it. I believe He just has. This is what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to give you 500 lei every month until you finish school. I also have a very expensive business suit and top coat I no longer need, and I want you to have them. You may not need them now, but you will this winter," he said with a smile. Attempting to thank his kind benefactor, he learned one last bit of wisdom. Very solemnly, the elderly gentleman said, "You need to remember that when you get some money, always share with others in need. You see, money doesn't really belong to us. We just manage it for God." Pavel felt as if he had air under his feet the rest of the way home. He knew his bride would agree that things were making a turn toward for better. The end of chapter 10. One miracle after another. The Pavel Goya story.